Good afternoon, everyone. I am Tiffany Feingold. I am the co-founder of Guiding Bright Minds. Thank you so much for joining us today. Our webinar is Learning to be the Most Powerful Person at the IEP Table. Such a topic of conversation, as we know that many of our neurodivergent children need extra help and services and supports in schools, and sometimes we don't know the best way to partner with the schools, what questions we should ask, what rights do we have. And so the most important aspect is our child getting what they need, what they deserve, and what they should have as far as accommodations. So I'm so super excited about this discussion today, and I'm so excited to have Michaela Oko with us with Unmasked Therapy. Before we dive into the presentation, I'm going to chat a little bit about Guiding Bright Minds. Many of you know who we are, but Guiding Bright Minds launched 4 years ago. I'm a parent of a neurodivergent child myself. I understand how hard and difficult and overwhelming this journey can be. And so I wanted to create an opportunity for parents to join a community where we support each other. And the first thing I did, because I was so overwhelmed by Google and where to go and what services, and when you get a diagnosis, you're thrown so many options. Well, there's all these different services, there's all these different resources, and you're like, where do I begin? How do I prioritize? So the first thing I did was create my directory, my neurodiversity directory. I personally meet with all the providers to find out why are they doing what they're doing. Amazing people that support us as parents, that support our children, that support our families, like Michaela is one of them. And so these parent webinars that I host are our specialists and experts in the field to bring that knowledge to you because of their expertise and their experience, and want to share that. And that's one thing I'm excited about Guiding Bright Minds. And it's not just providing you with a list of providers, but it's truly building a community that supports each other, that works together, that collaborates. And hopefully we can change the damaging stigmas and stereotypes that our kids face every day. When my son was in half-day kindergarten, it's only 4 hours. He was in the principal's office every day, and that's heartbreaking as a parent, because my little 5-year-old was so excited to go to school, so excited to learn, and here he's being ostracized because his body might not be able to control itself sometimes when it's loud and overstimulating. And I didn't want another parent to feel alone, because as we're going through this, I know oftentimes we feel like we're on the island by ourselves. Everyone's looking at us thinking we should parent differently, discipline differently, and it's hard. And so Guiding Bright Minds is here as a community to help support you as parents and help provide guidance and direction. And I'm so excited because on Monday, we just launched our Empowering Parent program. And I'm so excited about this program. I've actually been working on it for a few years, and finally launching it. I did a lot of parent surveys and a lot of discussions with you parents. And I know one of the biggest things, and what's been life-changing for me, is to connect with other parents of neurodivergent children. Not like a support group, but just parents where we can just chat and understand each other, and be able to share our experiences with others that understand and aren't as judgmental as I know some of my neurotypical friends are with their kids. And I don't have those conversations. So definitely go to the website. I'm going to put information on the chat, so you can see, but look for our Empowering Parent program. It's a membership program, and there's 4 key components. And one of them is that parent connections group, where we are going to get together with other parents, hopefully create lifelong friendships, play dates with our kids. I also have parent playbooks, which is detailed guides on how to guide you through processes. We have an Ask the Expert series and a Parent Power Hour. So be sure to check it out. I'm super excited about that, but let's get started on this conversation, because I know there's a lot of information when it comes to IEPs. In the bottom of the chat, or on your, what do I want to say, screen, is a Q&A box. If we could put all our questions and answers in there, So I'm going to turn it over to Michaela. And Michaela, if you could please tell us about your incredible experience, your background, and how you got started, and help educate us on being that most powerful person at the IEP table. And you're on mute. Oh,
Awesome.
there you go. Awesome.
Okay,
Thank you.
I was just waiting. Thanks, Tiffany. So as Tiffany said, we're going to talk about learning to be the most powerful person at the IEP table today. And so we're going to do a quick look at the agenda real quick. And our focus today will really be understanding your rights as parents to a child with an IEP. But everything we discuss today is with the goal that you leave feeling informed, confident, and empowered at the IEP table. So I actually love that Tiffany was just talking about the Empowered Parent series, because I just feel like it goes with it a little bit. So my name is Michaela. I moved to Colorado a little over 3 years ago from Florida. I have worked in the disability space my whole life in one form or another, like even when I was a little kid. I graduated from the University of South Florida, where I got my master's in special ed. And my official background is as a special ed teacher in Colorado for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I recently left the classroom after launching Unmasked earlier this year. So with Unmasked, I am very proudly a neurodiversity affirming practice. That is one of my core values. It's super important to me. And I provide educational therapy, IEP advocacy, and caregiver coaching. Educational therapy is available to school age students with intellectual and developmental disabilities, whether they're on an IEP in a mainstream school, all the way to homeschooling and unschooling. I work with students to identify what their barriers are to learning, which could be anywhere from learning disability to their relationship with learning. And then we work together to break through those barriers. Today is going to be a little bit more like what caregiver coaching looks like, which is where I support parents and guardians in navigating the special education system. When I provide IEP advocacy, I support parents in understanding what is being communicated throughout the meeting and ensuring that their child's needs are being met. But whether I'm at that IEP table or not, I really believe that parents need and deserve to have the information and the confidence to be an equal contributor to their child's IEP and advocate for those needs. So just a quick little overview of some IEP facts. The main point that is here is that IEPs are driven by a federal law. So a lot of the things that we're doing during that process, in terms of how we go about it, they are driven by a law called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is typically referred to as IDEA. And then I'll mention this throughout the presentation, but a common point of confusion for a lot of parents comes around the disability categories that can be selected on an IEP. And I just want to really push the understanding that it is not the same as a medical diagnosis. But I'll explain that a little more in a bit. And then I'm sure you all know that the IEP is designed to support your child's academic needs through mostly goals and accommodations. So first, I just want to do a little overview of what the IEP timeline looks like. It's a pretty fluid process, but I find that a lot of parents aren't thoroughly explained what it will look like. And considering this is a process that you're going to be in from the time, your child's maybe in preschool and it could go all the way through high school, I think it's important to understand the order that things happen in. So most of you are probably around here, where your child's already getting services, which means that you would have requested an evaluation or the school would have started one. They'd ask you for consent. They would do a first evaluation. And then here's where we determine if the student is eligible for special education or not. If they are, you're going to move into your IEP meeting. And then immediately after that, services are provided. And then once a year, we review that IEP meeting, but every 3 years, we do a reevaluation to make sure that services are appropriate, but that evaluation can happen more often if needed as well. and then it just kind of circles. So going through that a little more specifically, when we are requesting or referring for an evaluation, the school has a lot of steps that they have to go through before they can refer a child to special education. So if the school's on top of it, they might catch our kids quickly. But sometimes, because of all of these steps, if a student's not standing out to them, they can fall through the cracks. So that's where it's beneficial for parents to come in with their concerns and request that evaluation, which should always be in writing. Like anything involving an IEP should always be in writing, just to hold everybody accountable. And you're not going to ever want an eval more than once a year. It is a lot of testing, and it wouldn't be accurate if we did it more than once a year, but you can definitely do it more frequently than that required every 3-year one if you feel your child's supports aren't meeting their needs right now. So then the school will give you a written consent for the evaluation. And once you've signed that consent, the team has 60 calendar days to complete the evaluation. And if you're the one requesting that evaluation, there's not a set guidance on how long they can take to respond. But I would say a best practice is usually within 2 weeks, no more than a month, because they do have to gather their team and kind of game plan a little. But yeah, if they're on top of it, it should be no more than 2 weeks. So then we have that initial evaluation. This is before the child has ever been in special education. And this is going to be a thorough assessment done by multiple team members. And that should have all been itemized on the consent form. And so then you'll have an initial eligibility combined with an eligibility determination. What that means is we're going to go through that whole report, and the team's going to present their findings to you. And then as a team, meaning you are an important part of this team, you are going to have a discussion and go through the criteria for the different disability categories to determine what's most appropriate for your child. A student can have more than one disability category that they're eligible for. It's not better or worse to have more or less. You're really looking here to figure out which categories just paint the best picture of your child. Earlier, I mentioned that the disability categories are not the same as a medical diagnosis. And it's really important to know that, because your child might say have like a medical diagnosis of autism, but then when they go to school, they may or may not meet the criteria. It's literally like a checklist. They might not meet the criteria for that in school, vice versa. They could be eligible for it in school and not medically. And you're really just, like I said, you're just trying to paint the truest picture of the student, because then it's going to help determine the appropriate supports. It doesn't have any impact on the services you receive in the long run usually, but so that's when I would say a big red flag during an eligibility meeting is if the team tells you that if they don't qualify for this specific category, they can't get supports. Very rarely is that true. Some services, like usually like vision or deaf blindness, like those ones, sometimes they can't stand alone, and they do need that eligibility to get that service. But for the most part, if your child has basically any, you shouldn't be told that they can't get social emotional support unless they have an emotional disability. That's just not true. So if you're ever in a meeting and you hear something like that, like that's like when the little alarms go off in my head, because I'm like, why? It should be true for the kid. We're not picking the eligibility for the sake of getting a certain service, because they should all mostly be available. So then during the IEP meeting, which could happen at the same time as that evaluation meeting, or it could happen on a different day, depending on yours and your team's preferences. But during that IEP meeting, you're going to now plan what your student's going to be working on, what supports they're going to get. So the goals and services are the things that they're going to be working on and who's providing them. And then accommodations are a section that explains how the student's going to learn. So what are we changing in their environment that makes learning more accessible for them? So this could be highlighting directions on the top of the page so they're easy to see, or access to sensory tools throughout the day. It's not changing what they're learning, it's just making what they need to learn accessible. A modification is a more rare adaptation that can be provided in an IEP, but it really just depends on the student. So it's very common for students with intellectual disabilities because they typically need a completely different curriculum or completely different standards to be graded on. But there are definitely situations where other students can benefit from this. It's just not something that every student usually receives. And so then, like I said, that IEP is going to be reviewed annually, and that is where goals, accommodations, present levels, things like that can be updated because we want to make sure that we're pushing the student to learn and grow, and they're not always having the same one document supporting them. But if you wanted to add a service or change a placement, that's when we would do a reevaluation. And if we don't do one sooner than that, it would be at least every 3 years to make sure that everything is still appropriate and the students being supported to the best that they can be. And the most important thing here for you parents is to know how important of a team member you are throughout that whole timeline. Nothing should be done without your input, without, and it can be in so many different forms. A lot of times during evals, you're sent home questionnaires, and that can all feel like a lot when you're getting like these loads of papers, but that is ways to get your input on your student. But also at the meetings, it should never be you getting talked at. It should really be a back and forth conversation. And I think a part of learning to be the most powerful person at the IEP table comes with understanding all of this information. So while it can be a lot and everything, it's so important to know so that way when you're at that table, you know what to do and you don't have to like scramble to figure it out later. So the next big thing in terms of filling your information toolkit is called the procedural safeguards. So there's this older version and then there's this newer version. Either one that the school gives you is correct. They just made it easier to read. The new one's a lot nicer. But it is a very long, in-depth document describing your legal rights during the IEP process. And even before you even hit the table of contents, the most important thing that comes out of this document is knowing that you have the right to participate meaningfully in the development of the IEP. So that's not just discussing the IEP or being told the IEP. That is, you have the ability to help build it. And that comes from your input. It comes from asking the questions that need to be asked and advocating where advocating is needed. And that is just something you're legally protected to be allowed to do. And that is protected under IDEA. So, and then once we go into the introduction of the procedural safeguards, the only like big thing here is to know that it is a document you are given at least once a year. And that's part of how the schools are considered to be keeping you informed of your rights. Best practice, they should really be going through it with you, but because they don't, here I am doing it for them. Because it is a very long piece of paper and no, it's unreasonable to expect you to go through all these 30 something pages and then comprehend them without anybody like talking it through or explaining or answering questions. But you should be given it at least once a year. It's usually given at the annual IEP meeting, but it's also going to be given anytime like a big thing around their IEP is happening, whether they're getting an evaluation or they've been removed from school for too many days due to discipline. There's just multiple events where it might be given to you. So over the years, you'll get quite a collection of them. So then the second section after the introduction is your right to be informed. And they break that down into 4 categories of how the schools will keep you informed. So number 1 is your informed consent. That is, they must get in writing that you agree anytime they're going to evaluate your child, start special education services for the first time, do certain assessments like a behavior assessment. These are assessments that not the whole school is having access to, right? Like they're specifically doing it with your child. Changing their educational placement. And when we talk about educational placement, we're looking at the amount of time they're spending in general education with their grade level peers, as opposed to receiving special education services outside of that environment. And then anytime they want to release information about your child. So that's if you want them to collaborate with a private SLP or occupational therapist or something like that, they need your consent. The next way that they are expected to keep you informed, because you have every right to it, is when you're going through that eligibility piece during the eval, you have a right to understand these categories. There's 13, which doesn't sound like a lot until you're looking at all 13 lists of criteria, and then it feels like a lot. And the teachers ahead of time can weed out the ones that are obviously not appropriate. Like if your kid has no vision problems, you're not going to consider a visual impairment, but they can't make any decisions without you. So they're going to go through that checklist with you. And if at any point you don't understand it, you have the right to be explained those things. When your child is found eligible for special education, meaning that they have met at least one eligibility, you should leave that meeting feeling confident and understanding what just happened. And then the prior written notice is, I don't like the name of it because you often get it after something, not before, but it's anytime the school district is going to either propose a change or refuse a change. And so that could be their identification, meaning their evaluation and their eligibility, their placement, or their access to free and appropriate public education. And that's something that all students, regardless of disability, are guaranteed. So pretty much anytime you get a PWN, it's going to have that checked as that's what they're changing. And you're going to get that, like your consent form for an evaluation is a prior written notice. After an IEP meeting, you're going to get one that kind of summarizes everything that just happened. And these are ways that in writing, the school's keeping you up to date and informed. And then the last way is just a reminder that you are allowed to have any of your students' academic records. And that's protected under the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act. So anytime you want those, you're more than welcome to ask the school for them. So now that you've been through the whole IEP process, there's going to be disagreements at the table naturally, and they're not always a bad thing. I think a lot of times conflict leads to creativity because you have to problem solve as a team, which is how an IEP is meant to be. That is how the process was designed. So in the event that there's a disagreement at the table, there are ways within the procedural safeguards guided by IDEA of how to resolve those things. But I think there's more important ways to resolve conflict before we get to those legal steps. So your super important rights at the table are to ask questions. It sounds silly, but when you're in a room with, it ends up being a lot of people at these tables, ask the questions, interrupt people politely, but interrupt people and ask the questions. Don't go home not understanding what's being discussed or the jargon being used, or what decisions are being made. And then on that same note, provide insight, provide context, provide perspective. You know your child better than anybody at that table. You are the professional on your child. So you might not know all of the best strategies for, working on a speech disorder, but you know what makes your kid tick and you know what's going to help them. So if you have that insight, provide it. Advocate for your child's needs, meaning if something's not feeling right to you in that meeting, talk about it. Like tell them that that's not okay, and or ask why, or if there's another way. Um, and on that same note, you have the right to a professional advocate. That is to your expense, and there's all sorts of options. There are free options, there are paid options, but at the end of the day, a advocate's job is to make sure you're understanding what's being said at the table, but also that your voice is being heard, that you feel good about how that meeting is going. And if at any time you're getting overwhelmed, emotional, because even if it's a super positive meeting and it's so strengths based, it can still be a lot. And if you need a break, you're allowed to take that. So you're allowed to request to end the meeting and schedule a follow up so you have time to collect your thoughts, maybe like rethink some questions you might have, um, and just come back with a fresh perspective. Sometimes I think that's the most valuable thing you can do is be just like, oh my gosh, I'm the one who's overstimulated. Let me take a pause and we can do this again another day. Nothing has to be done in one meeting. It's nice when it happens that way, but it doesn't need to be. What's important is that your child's getting what they need. And then same thing, if you finish a meeting and everybody shakes hands and says, great, thanks for meeting. See you next year. And you go home and suddenly you start realizing things that don't feel right. You're reflecting and you're not feeling good about it. Email the case manager and say, yeah, I don't feel good about a couple things. Can you hold off on finalizing that IEP until we meet again? Like you can request that follow up after the fact. The important thing here is that they may have already finalized it by the time you've asked that, but that's okay because they can open it up again and it would just be like a new IEP review. And that's really just semantics. But an IEP can happen as often as it needs to happen. So anytime it's not feeling right, ask for a meeting. And then last here is if it's an evaluation meeting and there are decisions being made or scores coming back that feel really wrong to you, you do not have to accept those results. Now, you can't change them because they did the testing and they're the professionals, but you are allowed to ask for a second opinion. And that's called an independent educational evaluation. And that is at the district's expense. So you don't have to worry about that. And anytime the school does an evaluation, you are allowed to get one of those evaluations from a third party. So it has to be after their decision is made. There are some situations where if you had one previously done, they can reimburse you for it, but it really varies from district to district. So that's one that after you get the school's eval, if you're having trouble with it, you really don't agree with where they're going based on those results, you can talk to your district about getting an IEE and they'll guide you through their process for that. So then, like I mentioned, those are like in the moment, like discussions happening, conflict, we can get through it. But if you can't, and you really like things are just not going well, and the team can't come to an agreement, and that's getting frustrating, federal law has three options for conflict resolution. And on this screen, they kind of go from simplest to most complicated. And so the first one is mediation, which is where the state will provide a third party to come in with you and the rest of the IEP team and help guide that conversation. If that's not successful, you might go up to a state complaint, which is where having all of that documentation and everything in writing would help. because they're going to take all of your information based on your complaint, all of that documentation, and do a formal investigation. And they could side with you and say, yep, the school messed up. Or they could say, nope, the school is doing it right. Uh, but once they make a decision, you can't appeal it. But then once you go to due process, that's more of a legal um, conversation that sometimes will end in a hearing. So it's really depending on what's going on, but just know that you do have these options. All right. We can open it up to any questions.
Thank you so much. So much information, so much to
I know.
learn and
I'm
understand.
sorry if I went too fast.
No, that was great because I mean to break it down and so again, please if you do have questions, put them in the Q&A. You know, one of the things I do want to ask, I don't see any questions in there right now, is when you're going through this process, especially for the first time, how do you how do you prepare yourself to know what to ask? Because I think that's some of the problems right now is where you don't know what to ask, where to begin. So how do you break down, what struggles your child's having? And you might not have a teacher who's cooperative too, because a lot of the
Yeah.
information you might get from the teacher, but what if you don't? How do you begin as a parent?
I mean, I would always start with just being like open and honest in these meetings. And really, the whole evaluation process, I would hope you're being communicated with and getting some input on what's happening. So that way, then when you go into the eval, it's not all brand new. Like we always say, like at an IEP, nothing should be a total shock because you should, if it's not your first one, you should be getting progress reports telling you how your child's doing. Or if it is your first one, you should still be getting calls from the teacher about how they're doing that day if something was hard. And if you're not getting that, then those might be the questions you start with is like, how am I going to be communicated with to make sure his needs are being met? How am I going to be communicated with to make sure she's getting her services? That might be those conversations. Um, and you can also request like, all this sounds good. I don't know if I totally get it, but like, yeah, that sounds like a good goal for her. I think she should work on that. But could we maybe meet like a sidestep, just me and the teacher instead of this whole intimidating team and just talk through the ideas? Or you could ask for that before the IEP, like a little prep session. There's lots of options, but I think an advocate's always really helpful if it's something that's just feeling super overwhelming.
Yeah, and one thing I want to say, because I know, to let everyone know that there are also free services. Of course, there's advocates where that there is a cost associated. And one of the things I was thinking about is, I know there's going to be a big difference when you see probably an advocate and having that versus not being able to be equipped. But I know at least in Colorado, and I know I have a lot of following all over the country actually. These guidelines are specific for Colorado. I do want to highlight that each state's going to be different in what's available and what's out there. So I want to make sure to preface that. And also, one of the things as far as oh, I forgot the train of thought, but just to make sure that it was Colorado based and being able to support. Oh, but there are like Peak Parent Center and Rocky Mountain Human Services, some development pathways. There are ways in which you can get advocates at no cost as well. But having these resources will help when you go in with the confidence to be able to have those conversations, that you know what you're presenting, you know what your rights are, because that's important. Because, regardless, teachers or schools and districts sometimes will push back. I've seen some questions come in. Um, do you know, and I'm not sure specific, because again, these are, as the webinar, we want to make sure this generalized questions to be able to help everyone who's on here. But one of the questions coming in is, what is the process to get the out of district placement? Can you address that?
The out of district, are you talking about the independent evaluation? Because out of district placement's like a whole other thing.
Okay, I'm not sure. It just asked the question, what is the process to get it out of district placement? So if you don't have an IEP, then that they can request, I'm not sure. But so we'll move on from that question because that's not
Okay.
a part of the IEP process. If your child's getting, let's see, well, wait, let's see. Can you speak specifically about the IEP process under SLD for dyslexia?
Yes. So dyslexia isn't something that a school can test for. That has to be medically done. And so that's dyslexia is not in one of those 13 categories. So if you're being tested, it's going to come up as a reading disorder. So then the eligibility would most likely be specific learning disability. And sometimes other health impairment if they want to consider the medical diagnosis in there. But then yeah, there's I'm not sure what the question is. I mean, that's how the evaluation part would go, but everything else is very individualized to the student, and there's different interventions that can be done for dyslexia specifically.
Right, more reading time, having somebody maybe support different things, but each school is probably gonna be different with the type of services that are needed. And that's what needs to be determined is what specifically, because there's so many varying levels of dyslexia of where we
Mhm.
find and what that looks like. Another one I wish I would have found you years ago, we had a nightmare experience. I had to take it to the district. Nobody told me I could get a second opinion. Thank you for this information. It's overwhelming when the school is just focusing on academic goals, but not taking behavioral other needs that interfere with the academic goals. Totally agree with that. How do you address some of those non-academic goals? That's not the question, but let's dive into what are some of those ways in which a child can get supported.
Well, so depending on what it is, a big one, if it is emotional or behavioral, there should be social emotional goals being serviced by either the school psychologist or the social worker. All the schools kind of handle that differently, but a lot of the times it's a social worker. Um, but yeah, that's definitely a support they can get. And behavior wise, that's what the FBA is. That's a functional behavior assessment. And that's when the social worker and the psychologist and the teacher and whoever else needs to works together to determine why a behavior is happening in the classroom and what they can do to support that. And that can be separate from the IEP, but it can also be a part of the IEP. So a kid who doesn't even have an IEP can access that support. Um, and then also all of those supports can be built into the accommodation section as well. I've seen kids that don't necessarily need a full-fledged behavior plan, but they need some supports to prevent behaviors. And a lot of times it's something as simple as asking for a break a certain amount of times a day or access to sensory tools. Like it can be so simple sometimes. And it's just thinking and getting creative about what needs to be in the document and making sure it's getting implemented, of course.
Yes, yes. Another question, my district denied the IEP, and I also wanted to know if a different district could do the retesting as a third party.
So that's something you'd have to talk to your district about. They have guidance on selecting the independent education evaluators because they have to meet a certain criteria. And I don't have like a ready to go list off my head, but that is something you would discuss with them. But you do get the final say on who does the evaluation.
But like, so if you live in Jefferson County and they've denied it, and then, so you're, and then I say, can, Denver County or, Douglas County or whoever do it, do we have a right to be able to ask a different district? But the school probably would deny it, I would assume, because if they have to pay for it, I
They
don't know.
have to pay for it either way.
Okay.
Um, a lot of times it's done privately, though. It's usually not like another public school district doing it. So I'm not totally sure, especially because every district handles them a little bit differently. But you definitely have the right to another evaluation if they weren't found eligible and you feel they should be. But the
Okay.
school should have at least offered other supports because if your child was being evaluated for an IEP and then wasn't eligible, there's obviously still areas of concern, and they should be working with you to find other support, such as a 504 plan or something else. They shouldn't just leave you high and dry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. I'm not really sure what the question here is, but why do I always feel like not feeling confident with the school team and also feeling degraded? You know, if your child's getting D's and F's, the parent feels like their goals aren't being met. Um, I think a lot of parents sometimes feel like that, and I think, part of the conversation today is helping parents knowing what their rights are, how to better equip. But how would you respond to that?
I think a lot of that, the school is accountable for that feeling. Their job is to build a relationship with you just as much as it is to build a relationship with your child, because you are a huge member of that team. And if you're entering the meeting like you don't know what's going on because nobody's told you anything, you're not being treated as an equal member of that team. And so a huge piece of that confidence is having regular communication with the school and being an active participant. And if they're not initiating that, that's another form of advocacy on your part, is contacting them and saying, hey, like the IEP is coming up soon. How can I help? Like, tell me what's going on. Like, constant communication from both parties is going to make you feel a lot more comfortable.
Yeah, and it's hard to address as far as the grades that, like D's and F's or, what's happening. I know there was another question, if the comprehension scores are below, what should I do? That's where then I would think the evaluation of the IEP plan, what is it addressing? Do there needs to be longer time then for tests? Does there need to be, especially if dyslexia is included, somebody helping with assisting in reading. What do you call that? The text, speech to
The text to
text.
speech.
Yeah, text to
Yeah.
speech. Those. So if grades are in, I mean, like an IEP isn't going to have a direct correlation to a grade per se, but the accommodations to associate to help. What
Right. I mean, it's really hard to say without seeing, like, every kid's so different. But the way I'm like thinking of it right now is there's like two things happening here. Is one, what you're saying about accommodations, 100%. Yes. Like accommodations, I think sometimes can impact grades more than the goals. Because the goals, remember, like in the general education classroom, they're working on like 200 standards a year. Their IEP might have like six, and it's because they're trying to fill gaps. So they're not necessarily working on what they're working on in the classroom. They're trying to catch them up on the things that are holding them back. So they might be making a ton of progress on their goal, which is really good, but it might not have a direct implication on their classroom grades if what they're learning is different. But the accommodations can be super helpful because, again, it changes how you're accessing the materials. So, do you have extra time for the test? Are you using speech to text or text to speech? Are you doing it in a one on one environment? Extra time, breaks. There's so many options, and that's just a conversation with the team.
I love that. Yes. Once a child has received testing, can a parent request results of those tests prior to the first IEP meeting?
So, yes. Um, I think the best way to handle it is to let them present the eval to you and then do the IEP separate. That's just my personal preference if you need like time to process. Because if they just send you the written eval, it's still a lot to take in and it can feel way more negative sometimes on paper than when they present it to you. But absolutely, you can request an early copy of it. Best practice is a school should be sending you a draft at most 10 days before the actual IEP as well. But even 2 days before is pretty common. But yeah, you have that's again, it's a conversation with your team so they know that that's what you want, but you have the right to request any of that.
What is a reasonable amount of time for the same goals to be on an IEP before the team should critically look at them to
Yeah.
determine if the child isn't meeting them because they aren't meeting them, or if it shows they aren't being properly supported?
No, that's such a good question. Um, so like it should never be the exact same goal year after year. So you might be targeting the same thing, like you could be working on, I don't know, a CBC word for 2 years in a row, but the goal itself probably needs to be adjusted every year because if the student wasn't able to make adequate progress or significant progress towards that goal, obviously something wasn't working. So how they were doing it or what they were measuring or how they were measuring might be wrong. So sometimes a skill can take a while to acquire. And it doesn't necessarily have to be acquired in the year of the IEP, but if they're not making progress, I would question how they're teaching and how they're measuring that progress. Um, yeah, and I would make adjustments there. It should never be the exact same goal every year.
Along those lines, do you have any suggestions for what to do if a school says your child doesn't qualify for an IEP because they are doing well academically? Is there somewhere something to bring to show that my child can still qualify because needing to support in other areas? I hear that a lot. Or if they start doing well academically, then the school pushes to end IEPs. Like you don't need
Yeah.
one anymore. Well, I would think the IEP in place is what's being successful, but I'll let you answer that.
Yeah. No, so when you're going through that eligibility criteria after the evaluation, there are three checks that are on the top of all of them, regardless of what category you're looking at. And that is that it's not due to a lack of instruction, that it's not due to a language barrier, and that the the learning impacts could not be supported adequately in a general education classroom alone. So that's like that big one. That last one is like, how do you know? Like, that's where it's like a team discussion when you're checking those boxes. And if one of those isn't checked, done. Like, they're not eligible for special education. So if they decide, oh no, like they might be behind in class, but they can learn it adequately without special education, they're not going to be eligible for anything. So I think that's just where like that conversation around that piece, which I feel like so often is like rushed through and it's not a full conversation, that's really important.
So what happens when they fail to evaluate and then FBAs and SIBS SIBs and actually removing a 504 because of implementing an IEP?
That was a lot. Behavior plans should never be removed just because of an IEP, first of all, because like I said, it can be separate from or it can be in the IEP. Um, but no, that's not right. That should never be taken away because of that. But Tiffany, what was the part about evaluation?
Well, it just says, yeah, what happens when they fail to evaluate, and then it says dot 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 FBA and SIBS SIBs and actually removing a five, yeah, so that was it, and then actually removing the 504.
Yeah, no, I mean, you don't need a 504 if you have an IEP. It would kind of be the opposite. If you were to no longer qualify for an IEP or not qualify at all, a 504 would be supportive because a 504 is basically the accommodations without the goals and additional services. Um, and then as far as evaluating, like like I said, there's so many steps that the school has to go through to evaluate for special ed that some kids fall through the cracks. But the minute a parent requests it in writing, they don't have the choice anymore. They have to do it, or they have to have that discussion with you.
Okay. Should all educators in the school environment who are working with a child on an IEP know about that child's IEP or be provided access?
100%. So what a lot of the schools do is instead of the full IEP, because there is a lot of bulk in there that's not applicable to everybody, they do what's called a snapshot. So it's a shorter version. So it shows the present levels, the goals, and the accommodations, which are the big three that, like, say your art teacher would need. Your art teacher doesn't necessarily need to know like your math accommodations, but they do need to know your general accommodations for what they would receive in their class as well. And that would also include a behavior plan and any safety plan you might have. But yeah, anybody who's student contact, like the teacher 5 rooms down the hall, should not know, because that would be a violation of confidentiality. But anybody working with your student, like one-on-one, providing support or education, absolutely should be informed of that IEP.
All right. My son's school would not approve an IEP because they said there were kids worse than him. They said he isn't a problem child
Oh
at
no.
PACE, even though he is not even meeting grade level. He's in 6th grade now and still struggling. Can I request another IEP in middle school?
I would request an independent evaluation. Did they do an evaluation? They can't deny it if they haven't done the evaluation. So if they denied an IEP and they did an evaluation, I would request another one from an independent evaluator. If they didn't evaluate, I would request in writing, but copy whoever is above the special education department at the district level on that email. Hold them accountable.
Because if you request it in writing, don't they have like 60 days or something to respond? I mean, they have to do an evaluation there, yeah.
Yeah, it should be about 30 days maximum, but typically you should hear back from the school. Like in my classroom, it was usually like, oh, well, I have to get together with my team to like plan like who thinks they need to be on the consent form kind of thing, or like who wants to do a quick screener. So you want to give them a little bit of time to talk as a school team, but 2 weeks to a month is all they should need to respond. But yeah, if you requested in like verbally, a lot of times they'll be like, oh, well, you didn't request. So that's why everything should be in writing. But yeah, if you've tried that already and they denied it, go to the district level, copy them on it.
So the districts should be notified, because that's another question that's coming through. The district has to then get involved if an evaluation within 60 days of signing the consent form is denied, or does not do an evaluation. It sounds like they need to escalate to the district.
Yeah, I mean, if they're found ineligible, the district doesn't necessarily have to be notified unless you are confident that that's the wrong decision for your kid, right? Like then you want to get the district involved. Um, but yeah, if they're refusing to do an evaluation, 100% get the district involved, because they're not allowed to just deny you. And it doesn't matter if other kids are struggling more, your kid still deserves support. So they shouldn't be even allowed to say that to you, because that's wrong. Sorry.
I don't know if this is one that is along these lines, but are there disadvantages to moving a child from ASD designation to SSN based on intellectual disability?
There's pros and cons to everything. If you're in SSN, that typically means you're getting moved to modified standards, which means you're not being graded on the same standards, and your report card's gonna almost like, I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but it doesn't count the way it does for general education students. But the positive is that if your child has an intellectual disability, they're going to get the modified curriculum they need in SSN, where in an autism classroom, they're not going to get that. So it kind of depends more on, is it more important that they get like a typical report card, or that they're getting the supports they need? And are those the supports they need? Um, and SSN, it becomes like a blend of all the disabilities, but like some kids with autism are intellectually disabled and some aren't. And the SSN teacher is going to be more qualified and have the staffing to support that better than the autism program would in that situation.
Um, you had mentioned that with dyslexia, schools cannot test for, so what medical specialty would test for dyslexia.
I'm not sure. I want to say the pediatrician or I want to say a pediatrician could at least refer you
Yeah,
to who
educational
would.
psychologists, school
Yeah.
psychologists, neuropsychologists, like speech language pathologists. I think some of them do that.
Yeah,
To
it
help.
really depends on like the individual's specialties. So it's hard to say, but whoever you have in your network now should be able to help you find someone.
Yeah. And there's some great evaluators. Actually, if you go to Guiding Bright Minds website and you look at evaluations, assessments, there's a list of providers, and they'll indicate whether they specialize in dyslexia, but a lot of, and even your pediatrician could probably do recommendations, but
Mhm.
even there is still, I believe, limited in the scope versus like a psychologist, neuroeducational psychologist that kind of
Right.
knows that realm. Um, is it true that middle schools do not offer very limited special ed services? They have a sixth grader with full-time para, but we are told that is not available at middle school.
Um, it's kind of tricky to answer that question because elementary schools tend to over provide services in a way that makes you think that then they're not available in middle school. Like a one-on-one para is almost never actually written into an IEP. So then it's like something that some of the elementary schools will just kind of do with like extra staff or something. But then in middle school, it's not that they're losing that resource, it's that it was never truly like written in the IEP that way to begin with. But I wouldn't say they're limited in their resources. They are still they're still held accountable for supporting all of their students on IEPs just like an elementary school would. It just looks a little different because they're switching classes just like the rest of the school is, and um it's just different, but I don't necessarily say wouldn't necessarily think it's worse. And it's nice because it kind of matures with the student as they get older.
Oh my gosh, so many awesome questions. We're at the top of the hour. There is one more. What members of school staff can or should be should a parent expect will be present at the child's IEP meeting?
What staff members should be present?
Yeah.
Anybody who services the child, unless they notify you in advance and you sign consent saying that they can be absent. So, like, if they see occupational therapy and she can't be there that day, they can call you and ask, like, is it okay if I'm not there? And then they'll tell you about their sections and you'll sign consent. If you don't give consent, then they have to reschedule the meeting until that person can be present. But always, always, a general education, AKA like homeroom teacher, has to be present, as well as the special education teacher. Like those are minimum, but anybody who's on the IEP should be present. And when the school sends you the notice of meeting or like the invitation essentially for the IEP, it'll say the roles. It usually won't have the names, but it'll say like psychologist, special education teacher, admin, like whoever's invited, that's who should be there. If they want to bring anybody else in that's not on that, they're supposed to get your permission.
Awesome. Well, you see right here, Michaela's information, definitely email her. How can is there a phone number they can reach you at as well?
Yes, and that's listed. I should have put that up there. That's listed on my website too. And I also have like a consult request form and everything on the website. So yeah, definitely email me, call me, whatever. I'm happy to answer more questions.
It's a lot, and I know this is such important topic. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Michaela, for what you do. Thank you for
Thank
supporting
you.
families, and thank you all for taking the time out today to learn more about how to best support your child and be that most important person at the table. Appreciate it. And like I said in the chat, I will be sending out a copy of the recording along with the presentation. Have a good day, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye.